The Alabama sun hung heavy over Selma County in the summer of 1872, casting long shadows across the cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. But there was something else in the atmosphere that day, something that made the local townspeople cross themselves when they passed the Holloway farm. Reverend Elijah Holloway stood on the wraparound porch of his weathered plantation house, his black coat pristine despite the oppressive heat. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the property with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself chosen by God. Behind him, the sound of bare feet on wooden floors echoed through the house as his daughters prepared for what he called the evening devotion. "Patience, my child," he murmured to the girl beside him, his eldest daughter, Mary Catherine, now 16 and already marked for what he termed her divine purpose. Her pale blue dress, sewn without adornment as befitted her station, hung loose on her thin frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a worn leather Bible. The Holloway farm had been in the family for 3 generations, but it was Elijah who had transformed it from a simple homestead into what he proudly called God's own sanctuary. The main house, with its peeling white paint and sagging shutters, sat at the center of 200 acres of Alabama red clay. Behind it stood a smaller building that the locals assumed was a chapel, though none had ever been invited inside. As the sun began its descent, casting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, a dust cloud appeared on the dirt road leading to the farm. Elijah's lips curved into what might have been a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "They come," he said softly, and Mary Catherine's trembling intensified. The approaching wagon carried 3 men, all dressed in the somber black of clergy. But these were not the familiar faces from Selma's Methodist church. These men had traveled from distant counties, drawn by letters written in Elijah's careful script, letters that spoke of pure vessels and untainted souls ready for consecration. The wagon pulled to a stop before the house, and the men dismounted with the reverence of pilgrims approaching a shrine. The eldest among them, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes like chips of flint, stepped forward. "Brother Holloway," he said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a preacher, "we have come as you summoned. The Lord's work awaits." Elijah descended the porch steps, his boots echoing against the wood. "Brother Mordecai," he replied, clasping the man's hand, "the harvest is indeed ready. Come, let us not keep the Lord waiting." As the men followed Elijah toward the smaller building behind the house, Mary Catherine remained frozen on the porch. Through the windows of the main house, pale faces appeared, her younger sisters, ranging in age from 6 to 14, all watching with the wide-eyed terror of children who had learned too early that some prayers were answered in ways that broke the soul. The chapel, as Elijah called it, was a simple structure with no windows and only one door. Inside, oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls, lined with religious texts, though closer inspection would reveal that many of the passages had been altered, rewritten in Elijah's hand to support his twisted interpretation of divine will. At the center of the room stood an altar draped in white cloth, and upon it lay a single item, a leather-bound ledger filled with names, dates, and what Elijah termed sacred transactions. "The girl is prepared," Brother Mordecai asked, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "As the Lord commands," Elijah replied, "raised in purity, untouched by the corruption of worldly education. She knows only obedience to God's chosen servants." The other 2 men, younger but with the same predatory gleam in their eyes, nodded approvingly. One of them, a man with prematurely gray hair and soft hands that had never known honest labor, stepped closer to the altar. "The price remains as discussed?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah's smile widened. "The Lord's work requires earthly support, Brother Cornelius. $50, as agreed, a small price for such divine favor." As the men conducted their blasphemous business, Mary Catherine stood alone on the porch, her Bible clutched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had watched this ritual before, had seen her older sister Sarah led into that building 3 years ago, only to emerge hours later as a different person entirely. Sarah had left the farm the next morning with Brother Mordecai, and Mary Catherine had never seen her again. The sounds that drifted from the chapel, muffled voices raised in what Elijah called prayer, but which carried undertones that made Mary Catherine's stomach churn, continued for what felt like hours. When they finally ceased, the men emerged, looking satisfied, their spiritual needs apparently met. Brother Mordecai approached the porch where Mary Catherine waited, his eyes appraising her with the cold calculation of a man examining livestock. "This one will do nicely," he said to Elijah. "I'll return for her when she reaches her 18th year. The Lord has specific plans for her service." As the wagon disappeared into the gathering darkness, Elijah placed a heavy hand on Mary Catherine's shoulder. His grip was firm, possessive, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "You see, my child," he said, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence he used during his sermons, "how the Lord provides for his faithful servants. Your sisters before you have found their divine purpose, and soon you too will know the blessing of serving God's chosen men." Mary Catherine nodded mutely, though inside something had begun to crack. She had heard the stories whispered among her younger sisters, stories of what really happened during these sacred ceremonies. She had seen the fear in Sarah's eyes before she was taken away, and she had noticed how none of the sisters who left ever sent word back to the family. That night, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Mary Catherine lay in the bed she shared with her 3 youngest sisters. The room was sparse. Elijah believed that comfort bred weakness, with only a single window that looked out over the cotton fields. By moonlight, she could see the chapel, its dark silhouette a constant reminder of her approaching fate. In the distance, a night bird called out, a sound that seemed to carry all the loneliness and despair of the Alabama wilderness. Mary Catherine closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words that came to her lips were not the ones her father had taught her. Instead, she found herself whispering a plea for deliverance, though she no longer believed that any benevolent God was listening. The Holloway farm slept fitfully that night, as it always did after one of Elijah's sacred gatherings. But in the darkness, something was stirring, a seed of rebellion that would soon grow into something that even Reverend Elijah Holloway, in all his twisted faith, could never have anticipated. 3 weeks had passed since the men in black had visited the Holloway farm, and the oppressive heat of August had settled over Selma County like a suffocating blanket. The cotton plants stood tall and heavy with their white burden, ready for harvest, but inside the Holloway house, a different kind of reaping was taking place. Mary Catherine sat in the kitchen, her hands working mechanically as she peeled potatoes for the evening meal. Around her, her younger sisters moved with the quiet efficiency that their father demanded. No unnecessary chatter, no idle movements, only the purposeful actions of young women being molded into what Elijah called vessels of divine service. The kitchen was the heart of the Holloway home, though it bore little resemblance to the warm, welcoming spaces found in other farmhouses throughout Alabama. The walls were bare, except for a single wooden cross and a framed passage from Ephesians that Elijah had modified to read, "Daughters, obey your fathers in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord, and submit yourselves unto his chosen servants, as unto Christ himself." 14-year-old Rebecca worked at the stove, her movements careful and precise. At 12, she was approaching the age when Elijah would begin her special preparation, a process that Mary Catherine remembered all too well. The memory of her own initiation into her father's twisted doctrine still haunted her dreams. "Mary Catherine," came Elijah's voice from the doorway, causing all the girls to stiffen. He stood there in his perpetual black coat, his Bible tucked under one arm, and his eyes holding that familiar gleam of religious fervor. "Come. It is time for your instruction." Mary Catherine's hands stilled on the potato she was peeling. These instructions had become more frequent since Brother Mordecai's visit, and each session left her feeling more hollow than the last. She set down her knife and followed her father through the house, past the parlor where portraits of long-dead Holloway patriarchs gazed down with stern disapproval. Elijah's study was a cramped room lined with religious texts, though many of the books bore signs of his editorial hand, pages torn out, passages rewritten, entire chapters replaced with his own interpretations of divine will. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with correspondence from men across the South who had heard of the Holloway family's special ministry. "Sit," Elijah commanded, gesturing to a hard wooden chair positioned directly across from his own. Mary Catherine obeyed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor as she had been taught. "Brother Mordecai has written," Elijah began, unfolding a letter with careful reverence. "He speaks highly of your potential. He believes you will serve the Lord's purposes admirably when the time comes." Mary Catherine's stomach churned, but she remained silent. Speaking without permission during these sessions was forbidden, and the consequences for disobedience were severe. "You understand, my child," Elijah continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic rhythm he used during his sermons, "that you have been blessed with a sacred calling. Not every young woman is chosen to serve God's anointed in such an intimate way. Your sisters before you, Sarah, Martha, Elizabeth, they understood their divine purpose. They embraced their role as instruments of the Lord's will." The mention of her older sisters sent a chill through Mary Catherine. She remembered each of them, remembered how they had changed in the weeks before their departure, how the light had gradually faded from their eyes until they moved through the house like sleepwalkers. "The world beyond these walls is corrupt," Elijah said, rising from his chair and beginning to pace, "filled with temptation and sin, with ideas that would poison your pure mind. Education, independence, the notion that a woman might choose her own path, these are the devil's lies, designed to lead you away from your true calling." He stopped before a bookshelf and withdrew a leather-bound journal, one that Mary Catherine had never seen before. The cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and when Elijah opened it, she could see pages filled with his careful script. "This," he said, holding the journal reverently, "contains the sacred history of our family's ministry. 3 generations of Holloway women have served the Lord through their submission to his chosen servants. Your grandmother, God rest her soul, was among the first to understand the divine nature of this calling." Mary Catherine's eyes widened slightly. She had never heard her father speak of his mother before. The woman had died when Mary Catherine was very young, and Elijah had always claimed that dwelling on the past was a form of vanity. "She bore 7 daughters," Elijah continued, his voice growing more fervent, "each one dedicated to the service of traveling ministers and men of God who required spiritual comfort during their journeys. The Lord blessed her sacrifice, and he has continued to bless our family with daughters who understand their divine purpose." The room seemed to grow smaller as Elijah spoke, the walls pressing in with the weight of generations of twisted faith. Mary Catherine found herself thinking of her grandmother, a woman she barely remembered, but who had apparently been the architect of this family's corruption. "Your mother?" Elijah said, and Mary Catherine's attention snapped back to him. He rarely spoke of her mother, who had died giving birth to the youngest daughter, Abigail. She was not born to this understanding. She came from a family that filled her head with worldly notions, the idea that women should read, that they should have opinions, that they should choose their own husbands. His face darkened with the memory. It took years to break her of these sinful ideas, to help her understand that her only purpose was to bear daughters for the Lord's service and to submit to his will as expressed through her husband. Even then she struggled. She would weep when the men came for your sisters. She would try to interfere with God's plan. Mary Catherine felt a spark of something, hope perhaps, or recognition. Her mother had tried to protect them. The knowledge was both comforting and heartbreaking. But the Lord corrected her rebellion, Elijah said with satisfaction. Her death in childbirth was his judgment upon her disobedience, a reminder that those who resist his will face his wrath. The casual cruelty of his words hit Mary Catherine like a physical blow. To hear her mother's death described as divine punishment for trying to protect her children was almost more than she could bear. "Now," Elijah said, returning to his chair and fixing Mary Catherine with his piercing stare, "we must discuss your preparation. Brother Mordecai will return for you in 2 months' time. You must be ready to fulfill your sacred duty without hesitation or rebellion." He opened the journal and began to read from it, passages that described in clinical detail the services that Holloway women were expected to provide to visiting clergy. The words washed over Mary Catherine like poison, each sentence designed to normalize the unthinkable, to transform abuse into divine calling. As her father's voice droned on, Mary Catherine's mind began to wander. She thought of her sisters, not just the ones who had been taken away, but the younger ones still in the house. Rebecca, who loved to sing when she thought no one was listening. 10-year-old Hannah, who had once asked why they weren't allowed to learn to read. 8-year-old Ruth, who still sometimes cried for their mother in the night. And little Abigail, only 6 years old, who had been born into this nightmare and knew nothing else. Would she too be subjected to this twisted doctrine? Would she grow up believing that her only value lay in her submission to men who called themselves servants of God? The thought filled Mary Catherine with a rage so pure and fierce that it frightened her. For the first time in her life, she began to understand that what her father called divine will was nothing more than evil dressed in religious clothing. "Do you understand your calling, my child?" Elijah asked, closing the journal and fixing her with his expectant stare. Mary Catherine looked up at him, and for just a moment he saw something in her eyes that made him pause, a flicker of defiance that reminded him uncomfortably of her mother. "Yes, Father," she said quietly, "I understand." But as she spoke the words, Mary Catherine was already beginning to plan. She had 2 months before Brother Mordecai returned, 2 months to find a way to save not just herself, but her sisters as well. The doctrine of submission that had ruled the Holloway family for 3 generations was about to face its greatest challenge, and Mary Catherine was determined that she would be the last daughter to suffer under its cruel weight. The September air carried the first hint of autumn's approach, though the Alabama heat still pressed down on Selma County with relentless intensity. In the Holloway farmhouse, the rhythm of daily life continued its oppressive cadence, but beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. Mary Catherine had started keeping a journal. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the room she shared with her younger sisters, wrapped in an old piece of cloth that had once belonged to her mother, the small, leather-bound book contained her growing understanding of the truth behind her family's sacred ministry. Each night, by the faint light of a candle stub, she carefully recorded the details of her father's doctrine, the names of the men who visited, and most importantly, the fragments of memory from her older sisters. Tonight, as her sisters slept fitfully around her, Mary Catherine retrieved the journal and opened it to a fresh page. Her handwriting, self-taught through careful observation of her father's correspondence, was shaky but determined. September 15th, 1872. Father spoke today of the covenant of purity, his name for the arrangement with the traveling ministers. He showed me letters from men as far away as Georgia and Tennessee, all seeking what he calls untainted vessels for spiritual communion. The money they pay, he calls it offerings for the Lord's work. But I have seen how he counts it, how his eyes gleam when the payments arrive. Rebecca grows more frightened each day. She knows her time approaches. Last night I heard her crying, and when I tried to comfort her, she told me she had overheard Father speaking with Brother Cornelius about her readiness. She is only 14. Mary Catherine paused in her writing, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She had begun to understand that she was not just documenting her family's corruption, she was gathering evidence that might someday be used to stop the cycle of abuse that had claimed so many Holloway daughters. A soft sound from the next room made her freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, familiar. Her father was making his nightly rounds, checking to ensure that his daughters were properly secured in their rooms. Mary Catherine quickly closed the journal and slipped it back beneath the floorboard, then lay down and forced her breathing to become slow and regular. The door creaked open, and she felt Elijah's presence in the doorway. He stood there for long moments, his eyes scanning the room where his 4 youngest daughters slept. Mary Catherine could feel his gaze lingering on her, and she wondered if he suspected her growing rebellion. Finally, the door closed, and his footsteps continued down the hall. Mary Catherine waited until she heard his bedroom door close before allowing herself to breathe normally again. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Holloway farm. Mary Catherine was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. From her position, she could see a lone rider making his way up the dusty road, not one of the usual black-clad ministers, but a younger man in simple traveling clothes. Elijah emerged from the house to greet the visitor, his posture wary. Mary Catherine moved closer to the house, using the hanging sheets as cover while she strained to hear their conversation. "Reverend Holloway," the young man said, dismounting from his horse. "My name is Thomas Whitmore. I'm a journalist with the Montgomery Advertiser. I'm traveling through the county, writing about the religious communities in rural Alabama." Mary Catherine's heart began to race. A journalist, someone from the outside world, someone who might listen if she could find a way to speak with him. "I'm afraid I don't speak with newspapermen," Elijah replied coldly. "The Lord's work is not meant for public spectacle." "I understand your caution, Reverend," Thomas said, his voice respectful but persistent. "But I'm particularly interested in the role of faith in family life. I've heard that you've raised a large family here, and I thought your perspective might be valuable to our readers." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Who told you about my family?" "Oh, just folks in town," Thomas replied casually. "They speak highly of your devotion to your daughter's spiritual education. It's rare to find a family so dedicated to religious principles in these modern times." Mary Catherine could see her father's internal struggle. His pride in his twisted ministry warred with his instinct for secrecy. Finally, his vanity won out. "Very well," Elijah said. "You may stay for dinner, but I will not have my daughters subjected to worldly influences. They will not speak with you directly." "Of course," Thomas agreed. "I wouldn't dream of imposing on their privacy." As the 2 men walked toward the house, Mary Catherine's mind raced. This might be her only chance to get word to the outside world about what was happening on the Holloway farm. But how could she communicate with the journalist without her father's knowledge? The answer came to her as she continued hanging the laundry. Among the sheets and dresses, she carefully positioned one of her own undergarments, a simple white chemise, in a specific pattern that she hoped would catch the journalist's attention. Then, using a piece of charcoal from the kitchen stove, she wrote a message on the inside of the garment where it wouldn't be visible unless someone looked closely. "Help us. We are prisoners. Father sells daughters to ministers. Look for journal under loose board, northeast corner, upstairs room." MCH, it was a desperate gamble. But Mary Catherine had run out of options. She could only hope that Thomas Whitmore was observant enough to notice her signal and brave enough to investigate. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. Elijah presided over the table with his usual stern authority, while his daughters sat in perfect silence, their eyes downcast as they had been trained. Thomas Whitmore made polite conversation, asking carefully neutral questions about farming and the local community. Mary Catherine watched the journalist carefully, trying to gauge his character. He seemed genuinely interested in their responses, and she noticed how his eyes lingered on the girl's fearful expressions. When Rebecca accidentally dropped her fork, causing a loud clatter, the way all the sisters immediately tensed seemed to surprise him. "Your daughters are very well behaved," Thomas observed. "Discipline is the foundation of godliness," Elijah replied. "Spare the rod and spoil the child, as Scripture teaches. My daughters understand their place in God's order." "And what place is that?" Thomas asked, his tone carefully neutral. Elijah's eyes gleamed with the fervor that always accompanied discussions of his doctrine. "To serve the Lord through submission to his chosen servants. Each of my daughters has been blessed with a sacred calling to provide comfort and spiritual communion to the traveling ministers who do God's work throughout the South." Mary Catherine saw Thomas's eyebrows rise slightly at this explanation, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "That's quite a calling," he said. "Indeed," Elijah agreed. "3 of my daughters have already fulfilled their divine purpose, and my eldest remaining daughter will soon join their ranks. The Lord has blessed our family with this sacred ministry for 3 generations." As her father spoke, Mary Catherine felt a familiar mixture of rage and despair. He spoke of their abuse as if it were a privilege, their suffering as if it were a blessing. But now, for the first time, there was a witness, someone who might understand the true nature of what Elijah called his sacred ministry. After dinner, Thomas was given a room in the small guest quarters behind the main house. As the family prepared for bed, Mary Catherine found herself praying, not to her father's vengeful God, but to whatever force in the universe might still care about justice, that the journalist would find her message and have the courage to act on it. That night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere in the darkness, Thomas Whitmore was either sleeping peacefully, unaware of the horror that surrounded him, or he was investigating the desperate plea she had hidden in the laundry. By morning, Mary Catherine would know whether her gamble had paid off, or whether she had just sealed her own fate. Thomas Whitmore had not slept well in the Holloway guest quarters. The small, sparse room felt oppressive, and the silence that had fallen over the farm after dinner carried an undertone of fear that he couldn't shake. As a journalist, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when something was deeply wrong, and every fiber of his being was screaming warnings about the Holloway family. It was just past midnight when he decided to investigate the cryptic message he had found hidden in the laundry. The young woman's chemise had been positioned in such a way that it caught his attention immediately, too deliberate to be accidental. When he had examined it more closely while pretending to admire the family's industriousness, the charcoal message had made his blood run cold. Now, moving as quietly as possible through the darkness, Thomas made his way toward the main house. The floorboards of the old farmhouse creaked under his weight, each sound seeming to echo like gunshots in the oppressive silence. He had memorized the layout during dinner. The stairs to the second floor were at the front of the house, and the northeast corner room would be at the end of the hallway. The front door was unlocked, a testament to the isolation of the farm and Elijah's confidence in his control over his household. Thomas slipped inside and began his careful ascent to the second floor, pausing at each step to listen for any sign that he had been detected. The upstairs hallway was narrow and dark, with 4 doors leading off it. Thomas counted his way to the northeast corner and gently tried the handle. The door opened silently, revealing a room where 4 young women lay sleeping in 2 narrow beds. In the faint moonlight filtering through the single window, he could see their faces, pale, drawn, bearing the unmistakable marks of chronic fear and malnutrition. Moving with infinite care, Thomas made his way to the northeast corner of the room. His fingers explored the floorboards until he found one that shifted slightly under pressure. Working it loose, he discovered a small hiding place beneath, and within it, wrapped in faded cloth, a leather journal. One of the sleeping figures stirred, and Thomas froze. The eldest of the girls, the one he assumed was Mary Catherine, opened her eyes and looked directly at him. For a moment, neither moved. Then she slowly sat up, careful not to wake her sisters. "You found it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, holding up the journal. "Is it safe to talk?" Mary Catherine glanced toward the door, then back at him. "Father sleeps heavily, but we must be careful. If he finds you here—" "I understand," Thomas said, settling carefully on the floor beside her bed. "Tell me what's happening here." In whispered words that carried the weight of years of suffering, Mary Catherine began to tell her story. She spoke of the sacred ministry that had claimed her older sisters, of the traveling ministers who came to purchase young women under the guise of religious service, of the twisted doctrine that had turned their home into a marketplace for human flesh. Thomas listened with growing horror, occasionally asking quiet questions for clarification. As a journalist, he had covered stories of corruption and abuse, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic nature of the Holloway family's crimes. "The journal contains everything," Mary Catherine whispered, pressing the book into his hands. "Names, dates, amounts paid. Father keeps meticulous records. He believes he's doing God's work, so he documents it all." Thomas opened the journal and began to read by moonlight. Page after page of careful entries detailed transactions that made his stomach turn. Names of ministers from across the South, ages of the girls they had selected, payments made for what Elijah euphemistically called spiritual services. "My sister Sarah was 13 when Brother Mordecai took her," Mary Catherine continued. "Martha was 14. Elizabeth was only 12. None of them ever came back. None of them ever sent word. I don't even know if they're still alive." "And you're next?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Mary Catherine nodded. "Brother Mordecai returns in 3 weeks. Father has been preparing me, teaching me what he calls my sacred duties. But I won't go. I can't leave my younger sisters to face this alone." Thomas studied her face in the moonlight. Despite her youth and the terrible circumstances of her life, there was a strength in her eyes that reminded him of the abolitionists he had interviewed during the war, people who had decided that some things were worth any risk to oppose. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Stop him," Mary Catherine said simply. "Stop all of them. Use what's in that journal to expose what they've been doing. Make sure no other family suffers like ours has." Thomas nodded, but he could see the practical difficulties. The men named in this journal, they're respected members of their communities, ministers, church leaders. People will be reluctant to believe such accusations. "Then find the other girls," Mary Catherine said urgently. "Find my sisters if they're still alive. Find the other families who've been destroyed by these men. The truth has a way of coming out when enough people are willing to speak it." A sound from downstairs made them both freeze, the creak of floorboards, followed by the distinctive sound of Elijah's heavy footsteps. Thomas quickly closed the journal and tucked it inside his jacket. "He's checking the house," Mary Catherine whispered, her face pale with terror. "He sometimes does this when he can't sleep. You have to go." Thomas nodded and moved toward the window. It was a long drop to the ground, but there was a trellis covered with climbing roses that might support his weight. As he prepared to climb out, Mary Catherine caught his arm. "Promise me," she whispered urgently. "Promise me you'll stop them." "I promise," Thomas said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. He climbed out the window just as Elijah's footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The trellis groaned under his weight, and thorns tore at his clothes, but he managed to reach the ground without making enough noise to alert the household. Moving quickly but carefully, he made his way back to the guest quarters. The next morning, Thomas announced that he had received an urgent telegram calling him back to Montgomery. Elijah seemed relieved to see him go, though he maintained his facade of hospitality to the end. As Thomas mounted his horse and prepared to leave, he caught Mary Catherine's eye through the kitchen window. She gave him the slightest nod, a gesture of hope and determination that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Riding away from the Holloway farm, Thomas felt the weight of the journal in his jacket pocket. He had 3 weeks before Brother Mordecai was scheduled to return for Mary Catherine. 3 weeks to build a case that would bring down not just Elijah Holloway, but the entire network of corruption that had enabled his crimes. It would be the most important story of his career, and the most dangerous. But as he thought of Mary Catherine's courage and the suffering of her sisters, Thomas knew that some stories were worth any risk to tell. The unraveling of the Holloway family's dark secrets had begun, and Thomas Whitmore was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what the cost. The Montgomery Advertiser's newsroom buzzed with an energy that Thomas Whitmore had never experienced in his 3 years as a journalist. For 2 weeks, he had worked tirelessly to verify the contents of Mary Catherine's journal, following leads that stretched across Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee. What he had uncovered was a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Southern religious society. Sheriff William Crawford of Montgomery County sat across from Thomas's desk, his weathered face grim as he reviewed the evidence that had been laid before him. Beside him, District Attorney Marcus Thornton studied photocopies of the journal entries, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is comprehensive," Thornton said finally, setting down the papers. "Names, dates, financial transactions. If this is authentic, we're looking at charges of human trafficking, conspiracy, and..." He paused, struggling with the words. "Systematic child abuse under the guise of religious practice." Thomas nodded. "I've confirmed the identities of at least 12 of the men named in the journal. All of them are prominent ministers or church officials. And I've found evidence of similar operations in 3 other counties." Sheriff Crawford leaned forward. "What about the girls, the ones who were taken from the Holloway farm?" Thomas's expression darkened. "That's where it gets complicated. I've traced 3 of them, Sarah, Martha, and Elizabeth Holloway. Sarah died in childbirth in a remote cabin in Georgia 2 years ago. She was 15. Martha is being held at what's called a spiritual retreat in Tennessee, essentially a brothel disguised as a religious commune. Elizabeth..." He paused, his voice catching. "Elizabeth took her own life last year. She was 14. The room fell silent as the full horror of the situation sank in. These weren't just crimes. They were the systematic destruction of young lives carried out by men who claimed to serve God. "We need to move quickly," Thornton said. "If this Brother Mordecai is scheduled to return for the eldest daughter in a week, we can't afford to wait for a lengthy investigation." Sheriff Crawford stood up, his hand moving instinctively to his gun belt. "I'll need federal marshals for this. Some of these men have connections that reach all the way to the state capitol, and we'll need to coordinate with law enforcement in multiple states." Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. The wheels of justice were finally turning, but he knew that powerful men would not go down without a fight. The network that Elijah Holloway had built was extensive and well protected. "There's something else," Thomas said, pulling out a telegram that had arrived that morning. "I received this from a contact in Selma. Brother Mordecai arrived at the Holloway farm yesterday, 6 days early." The blood drained from Sheriff Crawford's face. "We're too late." "Not necessarily," Thomas said quickly. "According to my source, there was some kind of disturbance at the farm last night. Neighbors reported hearing screaming and seeing smoke. But when they went to investigate this morning, everything appeared normal." Thornton grabbed his coat. "We leave now. Sheriff, how quickly can you assemble a posse?" "Give me 2 hours," Crawford replied. "But Thomas, you're not coming with us. This is going to be dangerous, and you're a civilian." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Those girls trust me. Mary Catherine risked everything to get me that journal. I'm not abandoning them now." The ride to Selma County took most of the day, with Sheriff Crawford's posse of 6 deputies, joined by 2 federal marshals who had been hastily summoned from Birmingham. As they approached the Holloway farm in the late afternoon, Thomas felt his anxiety growing. The property looked peaceful from a distance, too peaceful. They dismounted a quarter-mile from the house and approached on foot, using the cotton fields as cover. As they drew closer, Thomas could see that something was wrong. The front door of the farmhouse hung open, and there was no sign of activity in the yard. Sheriff Crawford signaled for his men to surround the house while he, Thomas, and one of the federal marshals approached the front entrance. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their boots on the wooden porch. "Hello?" Crawford called out. "This is the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. We need to speak with Reverend Holloway." No response came from within the house. Crawford drew his weapon and stepped through the open doorway, with Thomas close behind. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood marked the wooden planks. But there was no sign of the family. "Upstairs," Thomas said, remembering the layout of the house. They climbed the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. The first room they checked was empty, but in the second, the room where Mary Catherine and her sisters had slept, they found signs of a struggle. The beds were torn apart, and more bloodstains marked the floor. But again, no bodies. It was in Elijah's study that they found the first clue to what had happened. The room had been ransacked, but Thomas noticed that the desk drawers had been pulled out and their contents scattered. Someone had been looking for something specific. The journal, Thomas realized. They came looking for the journal. Sheriff Crawford was examining a piece of paper that had been left on the desk, apparently deliberately. "It's a note," he said, reading aloud. It says, "The Lord's work continues. The unfaithful have been corrected. Seek us not, for we are beyond your earthly jurisdiction." Thomas felt his heart sink. They were too late. Whatever had happened here, Elijah and his co-conspirators had covered their tracks and disappeared with the remaining girls. But as they prepared to leave the house, one of the deputies called out from the backyard, "Sheriff, you need to see this." Behind the house, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, they found the chapel where Elijah had conducted his twisted ceremonies. The door stood open, and inside they discovered evidence that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. The altar was stained with blood, and scattered around it were personal belongings: a hair ribbon that might have belonged to Rebecca, a small shoe that could have been Ruth's. But most chilling of all was what they found nailed to the wall behind the altar: pages torn from Mary Catherine's journal, with certain passages circled in red ink. "He knew," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. "Somehow he found out about the journal. He knew we were coming." Sheriff Crawford's face was grim as he surveyed the scene. "The question is, are they dead, or did he take them somewhere else?" The answer came from an unexpected source. As they stood in the chapel trying to piece together what had happened, they heard a faint sound from outside, a child's voice, weak and frightened. Following the sound, they found little Abigail Holloway hiding in the root cellar behind the house. The 6-year-old was covered in dirt and blood, her clothes torn, her eyes wide with terror, but she was alive. "Abigail," Thomas said gently, kneeling down to her level. "It's okay. You're safe now. Can you tell us what happened?" The child's story, told in halting whispers between sobs, painted a picture of horror that exceeded even Thomas's worst fears. Brother Mordecai had indeed arrived early, but he had not come alone. 3 other men had accompanied him, and they had not come for a simple transaction. They had come because they knew about the journal. Someone, Abigail didn't know who, had warned them that their network was in danger of exposure. The meeting in the chapel had turned violent when Mary Catherine had refused to reveal where she had hidden the evidence. "Mary Catherine fought them," Abigail whispered. She said she would never tell them where the book was. Father hit her, but she still wouldn't say. Then the bad men hurt Rebecca and Hannah and Ruth, trying to make Mary Catherine talk. Thomas felt sick as he listened to the child's account. What happened then, sweetheart? Mary Catherine told them. Abigail said, tears streaming down her face. She told them the book was gone, that she had given it to the newspaper man. Father got very angry. He said she had doomed them all. Then... She paused, struggling with the memory. Then what? Sheriff Crawford asked gently. Then there was fire, Abigail said, and screaming. And Mary Catherine told me to hide in the cellar and not come out no matter what I heard. She said to wait for the good men to come and find me. As the full implications of Abigail's story sank in, Thomas realized that Mary Catherine had made the ultimate sacrifice. She had protected the evidence that would bring down the network, even knowing that it would cost her and her sisters their lives. But her sacrifice would not be in vain. The journal was safe, the investigation would continue, and the network of corruption that had destroyed so many young lives would finally face justice. The reckoning had begun, and it would not end until every man involved in the Holloway family's nightmare was brought to account for his crimes. 6 months later, April 1873. The courthouse in Montgomery was packed beyond capacity as the trial of the century reached its dramatic conclusion. Thomas Whitmore sat in the front row of the gallery, his notebook filled with details of testimony that had shocked even the most hardened observers. Beside him, little Abigail Holloway, now in the care of a Methodist minister's family who had taken her in, clutched a small wooden cross that had once belonged to her sister, Mary Catherine. The prosecution had built their case methodically over 3 months, using Mary Catherine's journal as the foundation for charges that had ultimately reached 14 men across 4 states. The network of corruption that Elijah Holloway had helped orchestrate was more extensive than anyone had initially imagined, reaching into the highest levels of Southern religious society. District Attorney Marcus Thornton stood before the jury, his voice carrying the weight of righteous anger as he delivered his closing argument. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we have heard testimony over these past months that challenges our very understanding of human decency. We have learned of a conspiracy that used the sacred trust placed in religious leaders to perpetrate the most heinous crimes imaginable against innocent children." Thomas glanced around the courtroom, noting the faces of the spectators. Many were members of the religious community, struggling to reconcile their faith with the evidence of systematic abuse that had been presented. Others were journalists from newspapers across the South, documenting what many were calling the most significant religious scandal in American history. "The defendant, Elijah Holloway," Thornton continued, gesturing toward the man who sat at the defense table, "stands accused not merely of individual crimes, but of creating and maintaining a system of human trafficking that operated under the guise of religious ministry for over 20 years. Elijah Holloway looked nothing like the imposing patriarch who had once ruled his family with absolute authority. Months in jail awaiting trial had aged him dramatically. His once pristine black coat had been replaced with prison garb, and his steel-grey eyes now held the hollow look of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around him. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Mary Catherine's journal had provided the roadmap, but investigators had uncovered much more. Financial records showing payments from ministers across the South, correspondence detailing the selection and preparation of young women, testimony from survivors who had finally found the courage to speak. Martha Holloway had been rescued from the Tennessee compound and had testified via written deposition, her words read aloud in a courtroom that sat in stunned silence. Her account of the years following her departure from the family farm had reduced several jurors to tears. "The defense would have you believe," Thornton said, his voice rising, "that these were consensual religious practices, that the young women involved were willing participants in what they call spiritual service. But I ask you to consider the testimony of Martha Holloway, taken from her at the age of 16 after 3 years of captivity. I ask you to remember the words of the other survivors who have come forward. These were not willing participants. They were victims of a systematic campaign of abuse that began in childhood and continued until they were either rescued or died." Thomas thought of Mary Catherine, whose courage had made this moment possible. Her body had never been found, despite extensive searches of the Holloway property and surrounding areas. The official assumption was that she and her 3 younger sisters had been murdered and their bodies disposed of to prevent them from testifying. But Thomas sometimes allowed himself to hope that perhaps, somehow, she had escaped and was living under a new identity somewhere far from Alabama. The defense attorney, a man named Cornelius Blackwood, who had been hired by a consortium of churches desperate to limit the scandal's damage, rose for his closing argument. His strategy had been to portray Elijah as a misguided but sincere believer who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals. "Gentlemen," Blackwood began, "my client stands before you as a man who was led astray by his own faith. Yes, he participated in practices that we now recognize as wrong. But he believed, sincerely believed, that he was serving God's will. The true criminals in this case are the men who exploited his religious devotion for their own perverted purposes." It was a desperate argument, and Thomas could see from the jurors' faces that it was falling flat. The evidence was too extensive, too detailed, too damning for anyone to believe that Elijah had been merely a pawn in someone else's scheme. The trial had also revealed the broader scope of the network. Brother Mordecai, whose real name was revealed to be Marcus Thorne, had been arrested in Georgia and was awaiting his own trial. Brother Cornelius had been found dead in his Tennessee cabin, apparently by his own hand, leaving behind a confession that implicated dozens of other men. The investigation had uncovered similar operations in 7 states, all connected through a loose network of corrupt religious leaders who had used their positions to exploit vulnerable families. The Holloway farm had been just one node in a web of abuse that had destroyed hundreds of lives over the course of decades. As the defense attorney concluded his argument, Thomas noticed a commotion near the back of the courtroom. A woman had entered, middle-aged, wearing simple traveling clothes, her face bearing the unmistakable marks of hard living. She moved slowly down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Elijah Holloway with an intensity that made several spectators turn to stare. The woman reached the front of the courtroom and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent space. "Elijah Holloway, do you remember Sarah Holloway, your daughter? The one you sold to Marcus Thorne when she was 13? The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Elijah's face went white as he stared at the woman, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Sarah?" he whispered. "I survived," she said simply. "I survived what you did to me, what you allowed them to do to me. I survived the birth of a child I never wanted, the years of captivity, the attempts to break my spirit, and I'm here to see you face justice for what you've done." The judge called for order, but the damage was done. The appearance of Sarah Holloway, alive when everyone had believed her dead, was the final nail in her father's coffin. Her presence in the courtroom was a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate failure of evil to completely triumph. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. As the judge pronounced sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Thomas felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it could never truly compensate for the lives that had been destroyed. After the trial, Thomas found himself standing outside the courthouse with Sarah and Abigail Holloway, the two sisters, one who had endured years of abuse and somehow survived, the other who had been saved by her sister's sacrifice, represented both the horror and the hope that had defined this entire ordeal. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked Sarah. "I'm going to find the others," she replied, "the girls who were taken from other families, the ones who might still be alive. This trial was just the beginning. There are more men out there, more victims who need justice." Thomas nodded, understanding that Sarah had found her own form of purpose in the aftermath of her trauma. "And you, Abigail?" The young girl looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "I'm going to learn to read," she said. "Mary Catherine always said that knowledge was the only thing they couldn't take away from you. I want to learn everything I can, so I can help other children like us." As Thomas watched the two sisters walk away together, one carrying the scars of survival, the other carrying the hope of a different future, he thought of Mary Catherine's final words to him, "Promise me you'll stop them." The promise had been kept. The network was broken, the perpetrators were facing justice, and the survivors were finding their voices. But perhaps most importantly, the story had been told. The truth that Mary Catherine had died to protect was now part of the public record, ensuring that such horrors could never again hide behind the facade of religious respectability. The Holloway family's dark legacy would live on in the legal precedents set by the trial, in the reforms implemented by religious organizations seeking to prevent similar abuses, and in the courage of survivors who had found the strength to speak their truth. Mary Catherine Holloway had not lived to see justice served, but her sacrifice had made it possible. In the end, that was perhaps the most fitting testament to her courage, that even in death, she had found a way to protect the innocent and ensure that the truth would finally see the light. The most corrupted family in the Bible Belt had fallen, but from their ashes had risen something more powerful than their evil: the unbreakable human spirit's capacity for justice, redemption, and hope.